The encounter. Maya Dawson adjusted the rearview mirror, her eyes scanning the road behind her. It was supposed to be a quiet, uneventful drive home. The late afternoon sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows on the asphalt. Maya hummed softly to herself, her hand steady on the steering wheel. She liked this route, a little off the main road, free of heavy traffic. It gave her time to think, to plan, and to savor the quiet before life demanded her attention once again. She sighed, glancing down at her belly. At 5 months pregnant, the small swell was just starting to show, but it carried a weight that went far beyond its size. She traced a hand across her stomach, a protective gesture as much as it was a comforting one. She couldn't wait to meet her baby. Already, she found herself talking to the little one when no one else was around. "Just you and me," she murmured quietly, smiling to herself. "We've got this." Her moment of calm was shattered by the sudden glare of flashing lights in her rearview mirror. The red and blue strobes reflected off her windshield, catching her off guard. Her heart jumped in her chest as a sharp blare of a siren cut through the air, forcing her to pull over to the side of the road. "What in the world?" she whispered to herself, carefully maneuvering the car to a stop. Her mind raced. Had she done something wrong? She wasn't speeding. She hadn't ignored any stop signs. The road was empty, and she'd been extra cautious, as always. Maya glanced at the rearview mirror again as a police car pulled in directly behind her. The silhouette of the officer inside was visible only for a moment before the driver's side door swung open. Maya's breath caught in her throat. Instinctively, she placed one hand on her belly again, her heart pounding harder now. Her father had always warned her about encounters like these. Be polite. Be cooperative. Don't make sudden movements. Keep your hands where they can see them. She had heard it all her life, but she'd never thought she'd find herself in a moment like this. The officer was tall, broad-shouldered, and intimidating. He approached the car slowly, each step deliberate, as if he were walking into a war zone. His uniform bore the name Jenkins, though Maya had no time to focus on that. His posture, the tightness in his jaw, and the cold stare in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just about a traffic stop. License and registration. Officer Jenkins barked as soon as he reached her window. There was no greeting, no warmth, just sharp, clipped words that landed like blows. Maya swallowed hard and forced a polite smile. "Yes, sir," she said softly, reaching toward her glove compartment. Her movements were slow and deliberate, just like her father had always taught her. "I'm getting my registration. It's in the glove box." Jenkins said nothing, but his hand hovered over his holster, his body tense as if expecting trouble. Maya's pulse quickened. This wasn't normal. Why was he so hostile? She carefully retrieved the papers and handed them over, along with her license. "I wasn't speeding," she added, her voice calm and measured despite the dread coiling in her chest. "Did I do something wrong?" Jenkins didn't answer right away. He barely glanced at her license and registration before fixing her with that cold, unblinking stare. His lips curled slightly, as if her question had annoyed him. "Step out of the car." Maya froze. "Excuse me?" "I said step out of the car," he repeated, his voice sharper this time. Her heart skipped a beat. Step out of the car. Why? She'd done nothing wrong. Everything about this moment felt off, and she knew instinctively that something was very, very wrong. I'm pregnant," Maya said softly, one hand automatically moving to cradle her belly again. She was shaking now, though she did her best to hide it. "Sir, I haven't done anything wrong." Jenkins' expression darkened. "I don't care if you're pregnant," he sneered. "I said step out of the car." Tears pricked the corners of Maya's eyes as fear began to claw its way up her throat. She felt small, vulnerable, beneath his towering presence and ice-cold gaze. Her mind was racing now. Comply. Just comply. Get through this. Slowly, she reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling as she pushed it open. As soon as she stepped out, Jenkins moved closer, his boots grinding against the gravel as he closed the distance between them. His presence was suffocating, his shadow swallowing hers. Maya instinctively took a step back, her pulse thundering in her ears. "Turn around," he ordered. "Hands on the car." "Why?" Maya's voice cracked as panic finally bled through her calm facade. "What did I do? I haven't done anything." "Don't talk back to me," Jenkins snapped, taking another step toward her. His hand went to his belt, his fingers brushing against the bed in there. "I said turn around." Maya could barely breathe now. Her hands shook, and she felt her baby kick inside her, a tiny, desperate flutter that sent a pang of sadness through her heart. She wasn't just afraid for herself anymore. She was terrified for her baby. This officer wasn't seeing her as a human being. He was seeing something else, a target, a challenge. "I'm pregnant," she said again, louder this time. Her voice wavered, but she tried to stay steady. "You don't have to do this. Please." Jenkins moved suddenly, his hand grabbing her wrist in a bruising grip that made her gasp. Pain shot up her arm, and her knees buckled slightly, but she forced herself to stay upright. "You think I care about your sob story?" He spat, his face inches from hers now. His breath was hot and heavy, and his words were venomous. "You people are all the same." The words hit Maya like a punch to the gut. "You people." It wasn't even subtle. Her stomach turned as the realization sank in. This wasn't about the law. It wasn't about a routine stop. This was personal. To Jenkins, she was just another black woman who didn't belong in his version of the world. "Stop," Maya choked out, trying to pull her arm free. "You're hurting me." "Stop resisting," Jenkins barked, his grip tightening as he spun her roughly toward the car. Maya cried out as her stomach collided with the metal frame, the impact sending a fresh jolt of pain through her abdomen. She gasped, clutching at her belly with her free hand, terrified that something was wrong. "Please," she screamed now, tears streaming down her face. "Stop. I'm pregnant." But Jenkins didn't stop. He didn't even hesitate. His grip remained iron-tight as he pulled one of her arms behind her back, twisting it painfully. Maya's body shook as she fought back sobs. Her heart pounded in her chest, the fear now unbearable. Where was this going? What was he going to do to her? A small voice in the back of her mind screamed at her to do something, anything, to stop this. And then, through her tears, she saw her phone lying on the passenger seat inside her car. Dad. The thought hit her like lightning. Her father, Chief Wilson. With a surge of desperation, Maya twisted her body slightly, ignoring the pain as she reached for the phone. Jenkins shouted something unintelligible, but she didn't hear him. Her mind was focused solely on that one lifeline. Her father. If she could just call him, if she could just get him on the line, he could help her. He could stop this. Her fingers brushed the phone, and with trembling hands, she grabbed it and dialed the number she had memorized since childhood. Jenkins noticed the movement too late. The line rang once, twice. Maya held her breath, silent tears streaming down her face as the world seemed to close in around her. Finally, a voice answered on the other end. "Maya." Her father's deep, steady voice filled the silence, and for the first time, Maya felt a flicker of hope. "What's wrong?" And just like that, the tide began to turn. The call that changed everything. Maya gripped her phone with trembling fingers, her father's voice steady but laced with urgency. It was the only thing grounding her now. She could hear the faint hum of his office in the background, but the moment he spoke, she knew she had his full attention. "Maya, what's happening?" His voice was low, calm, too calm. Officer Jenkins yanked her arm again, his frustration boiling over. "Who the hell are you calling?" He snapped, his grip like a vice. The force sent a fresh wave of nausea through her, and Maya staggered, her knees barely holding her up. "Dad," she gasped into the phone, ignoring Jenkins. "He's hurting me. Please, he won't listen." On the other end, Chief Wilson's jaw tightened, though Maya couldn't see it. Years of experience told him everything he needed to know just from the tone of her voice. He could hear it in her labored breathing, the cracks between her words, the fear. A fear he'd spent decades trying to shield her from. "Where are you, Maya?" His voice remained calm, but there was a sharpness behind it now, a blade hidden in velvet. "Tell me exactly where you are." Maya fought through the pain, struggling to remain focused as Jenkins loomed over her, his free hand twitching at his belt like a coiled snake ready to strike. "Exit 19 off Route 7. She managed to choke out, wincing as her back pressed against the cold metal of the car. Chief Wilson didn't waste another second. "I'm coming. Stay on the line with me. Don't hang up. Do you hear me, Maya?" "Yes," she whispered, clutching the phone like a lifeline. She couldn't let go. Not now. Jenkins snatched at the phone, but Maya turned her shoulder, shielding it with her body as much as she could. "I said, who are you calling?" His voice was a snarl, dripping with indignation. "My father," Maya managed to say through gritted teeth, her eyes blazing through her tears. "And you're going to regret this." The words were out before she could stop herself. Her father. She prayed he'd understand the weight of that name, the warning hidden in her defiance. But Jenkins only laughed, low and cold. "Your father," he mocked, leaning closer. "Is that supposed to scare me? You think I care who your daddy is?" His words sent a fresh wave of anger surging through Maya. "You don't know who you're messing with," she thought. But she didn't say it. There was no point arguing with him now. Not when help was on the way. Meanwhile, at police headquarters, Chief Wilson rose from his desk, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His assistant, Carla, looked up sharply from her station outside his office. "Everything okay, sir?" she asked, sensing the change in his demeanor. "Call dispatch," Wilson ordered, already striding toward the door. "I need a location locked on Officer Jenkins, now." Carla hesitated, stunned. "Jenkins, sir, is something. Now," he snapped, his calm veneer cracking. The urgency in his voice sent Carla into action. She knew better than to question him when he was like this. Wilson grabbed his keys and phone as he stormed down the hallway, his mind racing. Officer Jenkins. He knew the name, knew the man. There were always complaints, minor ones that added up over the years, accusations swept under rugs or buried in paperwork. Officers like Jenkins didn't operate in plain sight. They hid behind badges and authority, exploiting the system until they felt untouchable. But today, Jenkins had crossed a line he could never walk back from. Wilson clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the steering wheel as he slid into his black SUV. He'd spent his entire career walking a delicate line, being a leader in law enforcement, and a black man who understood firsthand the prejudice his community faced. He'd fought tirelessly for reforms, for accountability, for trust. But now, as the engine roared to life, all of that fell away. This wasn't about work. This wasn't about politics or optics. This was about Maya, his daughter, and someone was going to pay. Back on the road. The minutes dragged on like hours. Maya could feel her strength fading, the sharp cramps in her belly growing worse with every tug and shove from Jenkins. She held the phone tightly, pressing it against her ear, desperate not to lose her father's voice. "Sir, please," she whispered to Jenkins, tears streaming down her face now. "I'm pregnant. Please, I need to sit down. I can't." Jenkins's face twisted in anger, as if her pleading only fueled his rage. "Stop talking," he barked. "You don't get to make demands." The crowd was growing. A small group of onlookers had stopped on the other side of the road, their phones raised, recording the scene. Maya could hear them murmuring in outrage. "She's pregnant," one woman shouted from across the road. "What's wrong with you?" "Let her go, man," a younger man called out. "This is messed up." Jenkins turned sharply toward the bystanders. "Back off. This is police business." His hand hovered near his baton now, his posture tense, and defensive. But the murmurs grew louder. People were stepping closer. Someone called out, "I'm calling 911. You can't do this." Through the chaos, Maya kept her focus on her father's voice. "Maya, listen to me," Wilson said, his tone steady but urgent. "Help is coming. I'm almost there. Don't move unless you have to. Keep breathing, slow and steady. Do you hear me?" "Yes," Maya whispered, her body trembling. She could hear sirens now, faint but growing louder. Relief mixed with fear as the sound echoed off the empty road. "Please, hurry." Jenkins heard the sirens too. He stiffened, his expression flickering with uncertainty for the first time. His grip on Maya's wrist loosened slightly, though his face remained a mask of hostility. "What did you do?" he hissed at her, his voice low. "Who did you call?" Maya didn't answer. She didn't have to. The sound of the approaching sirens was answer enough. The police cars appeared first, their lights flashing as they pulled up alongside Jenkins's squad car. Jenkins's colleagues stepped out quickly, confusion written across their faces as they took in the scene. The crying pregnant woman, the recording crowd, and Jenkins himself, still looming over her like a predator. Then, a new sound. The low, rumbling growl of an engine. Steady and purposeful. The sleek black SUV pulled up behind the squad cars, its tinted windows obscuring the figure inside. Jenkins turned to face it, his frown deepening. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. The driver's door swung open, and Chief Wilson stepped out. The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to still as Wilson strode toward the scene, his presence like a tidal wave of authority and quiet rage. Jenkins's face paled as realization began to dawn on him. The black SUV. The commanding presence. The unmistakable man walking toward him with fire in his eyes. Wilson stopped just feet away, his gaze sweeping over Maya. His daughter, crumpled against the car, her face streaked with tears. And then his eyes met Jenkins. For the first time, Jenkins looked truly afraid. The confrontation. The air was electric with tension, thick and oppressive, as though the weight of the moment had pressed itself into every inch of the scene. Chief Wilson stood tall, his sharp gaze locked onto Officer Jenkins, like a predator sizing up its prey. Every step he took was deliberate, controlled, but beneath that calm exterior was a storm waiting to be unleashed. Maya felt her body slump slightly with relief as her father's imposing figure drew closer. Her tears came faster now, not from fear, but from the overwhelming knowledge that she wasn't alone anymore. Her father was here, her lifeline. The crowd, now numbering nearly 20 people, watched in hushed awe as Chief Wilson stopped mere feet from Jenkins. Some were still recording, their phones raised, their expressions a mix of curiosity, anger, and grim satisfaction. They knew something was about to happen, and they didn't want to miss it. "Officer Jenkins," Chief Wilson's voice was low, steady, and far more dangerous than if he had shouted. The calm before the storm. Jenkins stiffened, his eyes darting between Chief Wilson and Maya, as though calculating how he might still regain control of the situation. "Chief Wilson," he said, straightening his posture and squaring his shoulders. His voice wavered just slightly, enough for Wilson to notice. "What are you doing here, sir?" Wilson's gaze didn't waver. "What am I doing here?" He repeated the words slowly, each one sharpened like a blade. He motioned toward Maya, who was now struggling to pull herself upright. "You have my daughter, a visibly pregnant woman, on the ground, injured and crying. What I want to know, Officer Jenkins, is what you are doing here." Jenkins opened his mouth, but no words came out. His brain scrambled for an explanation, a justification, but none of it would hold under the weight of Wilson's glare or the dozen cameras still recording every second. "She was resisting arrest," Jenkins finally said, his voice gaining strength. "She wouldn't comply with my orders." Wilson held up a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Stop talking." The words weren't shouted, but they hit Jenkins like a brick wall. Wilson turned slightly to the other officers, two of whom were standing awkwardly by their squad cars, watching the scene unfold with obvious unease. "What's your role here?" Wilson asked, his tone still calm but commanding. "Why was my daughter handled like this? Did either of you witness her resisting anything?" The older officer, Sergeant Daniels, stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable. "Chief, we just arrived." Officer Jenkins called for backup. "By the time we got here, things were already escalated." "Escalated by whom?" Wilson shot back, his tone cutting. His eyes returned to Jenkins, his expression now unreadable. "You're telling me this woman, a 5 months pregnant civilian, was such a threat to you that she needed to be thrown to the ground?" Jenkins bristled. "Sir, I didn't throw her to the—" "Don't lie to me." Wilson's voice thundered across the road. And for a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. Even the crowd fell silent, startled by the raw force of it. Jenkins flinched, his face turning red, though whether from shame or anger was unclear. Wilson took another step forward, now just inches from Jenkins, his eyes locked on him with such intensity that it seemed to pin the younger officer in place. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I was doing my job," Jenkins muttered defensively. "No." Wilson's voice dropped, the anger boiling beneath the surface, dangerous and controlled. "What you did was assault an innocent woman. You abused your authority because you thought you could. You assumed she was powerless because of the color of her skin." He paused, his words cutting like knives. "But you made one fatal mistake, Officer Jenkins. You messed with the wrong family." Jenkins's face paled as the words hit home. His bravado was crumbling. He glanced around quickly, his eyes flickering toward the recording phones, then back to the sergeant and younger officer, who were now exchanging uneasy glances. Wilson didn't look away. "Sergeant Daniels," he said, his tone shifting slightly, "take my daughter to my car. Get her checked by paramedics immediately. She's hurt." "Yes, sir," Daniels replied quickly, stepping around Jenkins to help Maya. His voice softened as he approached her. "Miss Dawson, let's get you out of here, okay? Can you walk?" Maya nodded weakly, her body trembling from exhaustion and pain. Her father's presence gave her strength, though her limbs still felt heavy and numb. As Sergeant Daniels helped her toward the sleek black SUV, Jenkins turned to Wilson, his face now a mixture of anger and desperation. "Sir, with all due respect." "Stop talking," Wilson said again, his tone colder this time. "Do you really think you're going to talk your way out of this?" He gestured to the crowd, the foam still pointed in Jenkins's direction. "It's over. There's no hiding what you've done." Jenkins opened his mouth to argue again, but he stopped himself. For the first time, the full weight of his actions seemed to hit him. His eyes darted toward the onlookers, their expressions hostile and unforgiving. Some were muttering now, angry, incredulous words aimed directly at him. "She didn't deserve that." A man shouted angrily, "You should be ashamed. People like you are the reason we don't trust cops." A woman called out. Jenkins's hands balled into fists at his sides, his face turning crimson. But there was no fighting back against the tide of public opinion now. Chief Wilson stepped back slightly, his voice carrying enough authority that even the crowd seemed to quiet down again. "You're done, Jenkins," he said simply. "Get back in your car. You'll be hearing from Internal Affairs within the hour." "Sir." Now, Wilson's voice left no room for argument. Jenkins hesitated for just a moment longer, his chest rising and falling heavily as he stared back at Wilson. Then, realizing there was no other option, he turned sharply on his heel and stormed back toward his squad car. His movements were stiff and jerky, his face a mask of barely contained anger and humiliation. As he climbed back into his vehicle, the crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Some whistled loudly. Others chanted, "Justice." Wilson ignored them, his gaze still fixed on the crumbling officer in front of him. Maya's relief. Inside the SUV, Maya let out a shaky breath, her tears finally slowing as she leaned her head against the seat. The paramedics had arrived, checking her vitals and ensuring her baby was stable. The pain in her abdomen had subsided slightly, though her body still ached all over. Her father slid into the driver's seat moments later, his strong presence filling the car with a sense of security. For the first time all day, Maya felt like she could breathe again. "You're safe now," Wilson said softly, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. His face was still hard, but his eyes softened when they met hers. "No one's going to hurt you ever again. Not on my watch." Maya nodded weakly, her hand resting on her belly as she whispered, "Thank you, Dad." As the SUV pulled away from the scene, the flashing lights and shouting voices faded into the distance. The road stretched ahead of them, quiet and empty once again. But the world had changed. And for Officer Jenkins, the consequences were only just beginning. After the storm, the rhythmic hum of the hospital monitors filled the quiet room. The faint beeping of Maya's heart rate felt almost soothing against the overwhelming stillness that had descended. She lay propped up in the hospital bed, her hand resting protectively on her stomach, her thumb absent-mindedly rubbing small circles against her belly. The baby had been fine. That was the first thing the doctor had assured her after the examination. "Stress-induced cramps," he'd said, explaining how close Maya had come to a more serious complication. But the words hadn't fully registered. The shock still clung to her like a heavy coat she couldn't shake off. Her father sat in the chair beside her, silent and still, his large frame hunched slightly as he stared at the floor. Chief Wilson wasn't often seen like this. To everyone else, he was a force of nature, a pillar of strength and authority. But here, in the sterile quiet of the hospital room, he looked smaller, tired, the weight of the day etched into every line on his face. Maya turned her head slightly to look at him, her voice soft but clear. "Dad." Wilson glanced up quickly, his face softening as he met her gaze. "Yeah, baby girl. Is it over?" Her voice trembled just slightly, betraying the strength she was trying so hard to hold on to. Wilson let out a slow breath, leaning forward to rest his forearms on his knees. "It's not over yet," he said quietly. "But it will be. I promise you that." Maya swallowed hard, her throat tight. "What's going to happen to him?" "Jenkins." Wilson's jaw clenched at the name, but he kept his voice steady. "Internal Affairs is already investigating him. They'll review the footage from the bystanders and my body cam. There's no way he gets out of this." His gaze darkened slightly, his voice dropping lower. "I'll make sure of that." Maya nodded slowly, though the answer didn't bring as much comfort as she thought it would. Jenkins's face still haunted her, the hatred in his eyes, the way his grip had felt like iron, unyielding and cruel. It was as if he hadn't seen her as a person at all, just something to control, to dominate. "How many others, Dad?" she whispered. "How many others has he done this to?" Wilson's silence was answer enough. He didn't know the exact number, but they both understood the truth. Too many. Officer Jenkins was a symptom of something much larger, something far more insidious. Maya had been lucky, if you could even call it that. The cameras, the crowd, her father arriving just in time, those things had saved her. But what about the ones who didn't get that chance? Maya's voice hardened as she said, "He can't just lose his badge. That's not enough." Wilson looked at her for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. Finally, he said, "I know." The fallout begins. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was tense, a quiet unease hanging over the entire building like a storm cloud. Everyone knew about the incident. They'd seen the videos. The footage had already gone viral, spreading like wildfire across social media. The hashtag Justice for Maya was trending, and every major news outlet had picked up the story. Inside the chief's office, Wilson stood behind his desk, his broad shoulders taut as he stared down at the small group of senior officers assembled before him. The door was closed, the blinds drawn, and the air was thick with unspoken tension. "Let me make this perfectly clear," Wilson said, his voice cold and deliberate. What happened yesterday was unacceptable, on every level. The officers shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, but no one dared to speak. Wilson's hands rested on the edge of the desk as he leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning each face in the room. I've spent my entire career trying to build trust between this department and the people we serve, and in a matter of minutes, Jenkins shattered that trust. He abused his badge, and he abused his authority. He straightened up, his voice growing sharper. I won't tolerate it. Jenkins is done here. He'll face a disciplinary hearing first thing Monday morning, and I expect every one of you to cooperate with internal affairs. Am I clear? Yes, sir, came the collective murmurs of agreement, though the unease in the room didn't lift. Wilson's gaze lingered on one officer in particular, Lieutenant Harris, Jenkins's direct supervisor. Harris had been quiet throughout the meeting, his face carefully neutral, but Wilson could see the guilt simmering just beneath the surface. Lieutenant Harris, Wilson said, his voice quieter now, but no less commanding. How many complaints did Jenkins have on record? Harris hesitated, shifting slightly before replying. 12, sir. Mostly minor incidents. Nothing that stood out. 12 complaints, Wilson repeated, his tone like ice. And you're telling me none of them stood out? Harris swallowed hard, but he didn't answer. There was nothing he could say. Wilson's anger burned like a quiet fire, not just at Jenkins, but at the system that had enabled him. The system that turned a blind eye until something catastrophic happened. Get out, Wilson said finally, his voice soft but firm. All of you. I've got work to do. The officers filed out quickly, leaving Wilson alone in his office. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of his phone vibrating on the desk. He picked it up, his brows furrowing as he saw the name on the screen. It was the mayor. Maya finds her strength. Days later, Maya sat at the kitchen table in her father's house, a cup of tea cradled in her hands as the sunlight streamed through the window. It had been a long few days. Reporters at the hospital, calls from lawyers, and endless news coverage of the incident. She felt wrung out, like all the energy had been drained from her body. But beneath the exhaustion was something new, something stronger. Resolve. Her father entered the room, his expression softening as he saw her sitting there. You okay, kiddo? Maya nodded, setting down her tea. I want to press charges, she said firmly, looking up at him. Wilson's brows lifted slightly, though he wasn't surprised. I thought you might. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else, she continued, her voice steady. I can't just let this go. He has to be held accountable. And not just him. The system that protected him has to change too. Wilson studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. Then that's what we'll do. Maya let out a slow breath, feeling the weight lift off her chest. It wouldn't be easy. She knew that. There would be battles ahead, legal fights, media attention, and no shortage of backlash. But she wouldn't let that stop her. She wouldn't let fear silence her voice. She placed a hand on her belly, her resolve hardening further. For my baby. For everyone. Her father reached out and placed a strong, reassuring hand on her shoulder. I'm proud of you, Maya, he said quietly. We'll fight this together. Outside the window, the world seemed brighter. It wasn't fixed. Not yet. But change was coming. Maya could feel it. And she wouldn't stop until it arrived. A reckoning. The courtroom was silent, save for the shuffle of papers and the faint hum of whispers among the reporters seated along the back rows. The stark overhead lights seemed harsher than usual, highlighting the tension in the air. Every seat in the gallery was filled, with more people crammed outside the courthouse, eager for updates on the case that had ignited the entire city. Maya sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture upright, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She wore a simple dark dress that hugged her growing belly, a quiet but powerful reminder of everything she had fought to protect. Her father sat beside her, his presence a pillar of strength that grounded her. He had fought for justice his entire life, But this time, it was personal. On the other side of the room sat Officer Jenkins. The once confident man now seemed smaller, slumped in his chair with his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. The defiance that had once hardened his features was gone, replaced by a dull mask of uncertainty and frustration. He was no longer untouchable. The judge's gavel banged, pulling everyone's attention back to the front of the room. Order in the court. The prosecutor stood and began her opening statement. She was sharp, articulate, and unrelenting as she outlined the case. "This is about more than one officer's misconduct," she declared, her voice echoing through the chamber. "This is about abuse of power, unchecked authority, and the consequences of systemic negligence. Maya Dawson's rights were violated, her safety compromised, and her trust shattered by a man sworn to protect her." Jenkins's lawyer countered quickly, trying to reframe the narrative. Officer Jenkins acted according to protocol under a reasonable belief that Ms. Dawson was resisting his lawful orders. He gestured toward Jenkins, who sat stoically. There was no malice here, only a misunderstanding escalated by unfortunate circumstances. Maya's blood boiled at the words, but she stayed calm. Misunderstanding. That wasn't a misunderstanding. Jenkins's hatred had been clear in every word, every action. It wasn't just an incident. It was a reflection of something far deeper, something systemic that could no longer be ignored. The city reacts. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had swelled to hundreds. Protesters, supporters, activists, and reporters all crammed into the square. Signs reading "Justice for Maya" and "End Police Brutality" waved above the throng, their voices a constant hum of passion and unrest. The incident had sparked outrage far beyond Maya's city. The footage of her encounter with Jenkins had gone national, even global, igniting debates on race, power, and accountability. Maya hadn't asked for any of this attention, but she couldn't ignore it. People had begun to see her as a symbol of resilience, of injustice, of hope for change. She wasn't sure she deserved the title, but as she looked out the courthouse window, she realized something profound. This wasn't just about her anymore. Jenkins faces the evidence. The prosecutor's case was airtight. Footage from the bystanders' phones painted a clear and damning picture. Jenkins towering over Maya, yelling, grabbing her wrist, forcing her toward the pavement as she cried out about her pregnancy. The crowd's shouts echoed in the background, punctuated by Maya's gasps and pleas for mercy. The turning point came when the prosecutor called Chief Wilson to the stand. The courtroom fell even quieter as he approached, his crisp suit and stern demeanor commanding the space just as they had on the day of the incident. "Chief Wilson," the prosecutor began, "can you explain what you saw when you arrived on the scene that day?" Wilson's voice was steady but filled with an undertone of emotion. "I saw my daughter, a 5 months pregnant woman, on the ground, terrified and in pain. I saw Officer Jenkins standing over her, refusing to listen to her pleas or to the crowd calling out for him to stop. It was clear he was out of control." The prosecutor nodded. "Did Ms. Dawson resist Officer Jenkins in any way, from your perspective?" Wilson's jaw tightened as he looked directly at Jenkins. "No. My daughter complied as much as she physically could under the circumstances. Officer Jenkins escalated the situation without cause." The defense lawyer attempted to challenge him, but Wilson's words held weight. As the head of the police department, and as a father, his testimony was indisputable. The final blow came when Internal Affairs presented Jenkins's disciplinary record. 12 complaints over the years, ranging from verbal aggression to excessive force. Each incident, once seen as minor, now painted a clear picture of a man emboldened by a system that refused to hold him accountable. Maya's turn. The prosecutor's voice was gentle when she called Maya to the stand. The gallery watched intently as she stood and walked slowly toward the witness box, her father giving her a reassuring nod. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat down, but her voice remained steady when she was sworn in. "Ms. Dawson," the prosecutor began, "can you tell us how you felt during the encounter with Officer Jenkins?" Maya swallowed hard, the memories bubbling up as fresh as if they'd happened yesterday. She took a breath. "I was terrified," she said softly, her voice carrying through the silent room. "I didn't understand why he was so angry. I kept thinking, what did I do? I knew I had to stay calm. For my baby. But no matter what I said, he didn't listen. He looked at me like I wasn't even human." The gallery murmured softly, some dabbing their eyes as Maya's words hung in the air. "And when my father arrived," she continued, looking directly at Jenkins now, "I realized how close I'd come to something much worse. If no one had been watching, if no one had recorded, what would have happened to me? What would have happened to my baby?" Jenkins shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting downward. For the first time, Maya saw something other than anger on his face. Guilt, maybe even shame. "I'm here today," Maya said firmly, "because I survived. But I know there are others who didn't. I refuse to let this keep happening. Officers like him can't hide behind a badge anymore." The room erupted into quiet applause, hushed but undeniable. Even the judge didn't reprimand the gallery. Maya's words had hit their mark. The verdict. Days later, the jury returned with their decision. The courtroom was packed as everyone waited with bated breath. Jenkins sat rigid in his chair, his face pale. Maya sat beside her father, clutching his hand tightly. The foreperson stood, her voice calm and clear. "We, the jury, find Officer Michael Jenkins guilty of assault and misconduct in office." A wave of relief washed over Maya as she exhaled, tears filling her eyes. Her father squeezed her hand gently, his own face etched with a mix of pride and sorrow. Jenkins' expression crumbled, his lawyer whispering frantically in his ear, but the damage was done. Justice had been served. Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the courthouse steps. Reporters jostled for position, their microphones and cameras pointed in every direction. But Maya didn't hear them. For the first time in weeks, she felt a semblance of peace. Her father stood beside her, his arm wrapped around her shoulders as they walked through the throng of supporters. People called her name, reaching out to thank her, to praise her. Maya smiled faintly, her voice steady as she spoke to a reporter who pushed a mic toward her. "This isn't just about me," she said. "This is about accountability. It's about the voices of those who've been silenced for too long. We have to keep fighting for change, because this is only the beginning." And as the crowd roared in agreement, Maya knew she was ready to keep going. For her baby, for her family, for justice. A new dawn. The courtroom, the flashing cameras, the chants of protesters, everything had faded into memory. Weeks had passed since Officer Jenkins' guilty verdict, but the echoes of that moment continued to ripple through Maya's life. The world hadn't simply gone back to normal. It couldn't. From her seat on the front porch of her father's house, Maya watched the golden light of early morning stretch across the yard. The wind carried a quiet calm, rustling the leaves of the old oak tree that had been there since her childhood. She cradled a cup of tea in her hands, her fingers tracing the rim as she took in the quiet. For once, silence didn't feel heavy or empty. "Mama, look." The voice of her niece, little Ella, cut through the stillness. The 7-year-old dashed across the yard with a stick, battling imaginary enemies with the unbridled energy only children possessed. Her laughter floated through the air like music. Maya smiled faintly, her hand instinctively brushing against her belly, which was now round and full at 8 months. A new life was on the horizon, and with it, hope. Her father's voice broke through her thoughts. "Morning, sweetheart," Chief Wilson said softly, stepping onto the porch with his own mug of coffee. He eased into the chair beside her, his movements slower than they'd once been. The past month had taken its toll on him, too. "Morning, Dad," Maya replied, offering him a small but genuine smile. They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Wilson spoke again. "You've been quiet the last few days." "I've been thinking," she admitted, her voice calm but deliberate, "about what's next. Wilson turned to her, his brow furrowed slightly. Next. Maya nodded, her hand never leaving her belly. People are still talking about what happened. I see the posts online, the letters people send me. Stories about how they've been treated, how they're scared to speak up. It's like they're waiting for someone to lead them. Her father watched her carefully, his pride evident despite the concern in his eyes. You've already done enough, Maya. You fought back. You got justice. That's just it, Dad, Maya said, turning to look at him fully. Justice shouldn't have to be fought for. It should be there. What happened to me isn't unique. I was just lucky to have you and those people recording. What about the ones who didn't? Wilson sighed, setting his coffee down. What are you saying? I want to start something, Maya said, determination flickering in her eyes. A foundation. Something that helps families, people like me who've been hurt, but don't have the means to fight back. Something that helps hold officers accountable, while also helping bridge the gap between communities and law enforcement. Wilson studied her for a moment, his face unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. That's a big undertaking. I know, Maya said, but if we don't do something now, when will we? Her father's expression softened. Your mother would be so proud of you, Maya. You're already stronger than anyone I know. Maya blinked back the sudden rush of tears, smiling faintly as she looked out over the yard again. I want my baby to grow up in a better world, one where they don't have to be afraid of someone just because they wear a badge. Wilson reached over, squeezing her hand gently. Then let's make that happen. The birth of a movement. Maya's idea turned into reality faster than she expected. With her father's connections, media attention, and community support, the Dawson Foundation for Justice was born. It started small, a few grants to families who had experienced excessive force, resources for victims of systemic abuse, and legal assistance for those who couldn't afford to fight their battles alone. But the movement grew. At a press conference just a month later, Maya stood at a podium in front of a packed room. Her belly was prominent beneath her navy dress, but her presence was steady, her voice powerful. Her father stood proudly beside her, flanked by leaders from community organizations and representatives of law enforcement who supported the Foundation's mission. To every person who's afraid to speak up, afraid they won't be heard, I see you, Maya said into the microphone, her voice unwavering. We won't stop until accountability becomes the standard, not the exception. Change starts here, and it starts now. Applause erupted, cameras flashing as Maya stepped back. She hadn't chosen this spotlight. It had been thrust upon her. But now she understood her purpose. And for the first time in months, she felt strong. Maya's new chapter. 2 months later, the hospital room was filled with soft light and quiet laughter. Maya lay in the bed, cradling her newborn daughter, Amara Grace Dawson. The baby's tiny fingers curled around her thumb, her soft breaths rhythmic and steady. Her father sat in the chair beside her, his face softened in wonder as he watched the baby sleep. She's perfect, Wilson whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She's a fighter, Maya replied, smiling down at her daughter. Just like her grandfather. Wilson chuckled softly. And her mother. The weight of everything that had happened, the fear, the anger, the pain, felt distant now, though not forgotten. Jenkins had been sentenced to prison, stripped of his badge, and marked forever by his actions. The system wasn't fixed overnight, but Maya's fight had forced conversations no one could ignore anymore. The Dawson Foundation was growing, becoming a beacon of hope for families across the country. Maya knew it wouldn't solve everything. Change would be slow, painful even, but she was ready to see it through. Amara stirred slightly in her arms, her little face scrunching up before settling again. Maya smiled softly, her heart full in a way she hadn't thought possible. This is why we fight, she whispered, as much to herself as to the sleeping infant. For them. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady. And we're just getting started. Maya nodded, her eyes filled with a quiet determination that had become her signature. Outside the window, the sun was rising, painting the horizon in hues of orange and gold. A new day full of promise. And this time, Maya knew she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. Epilogue. A legacy. Years later, a plaque stood outside the Dawson Foundation headquarters, its bronze letters glinting in the sunlight. Justice delayed is justice denied. Let us be the voice for those who cannot speak. Maya Dawson. A young woman stood in front of the plaque, tracing the name with her fingertips. She had come seeking help, unsure of where else to turn. But standing here now, she felt hope. Inside, the foundation buzzed with life. Lawyers, volunteers, advocates, all working together to fight for justice. The movement Maya started had become a legacy, and her story had inspired countless others to stand up and speak out. In her corner office, Maya, now older but just as fierce, sat at her desk with Amara, now a teenager, reviewing scholarship applications for children impacted by police violence. "Mom, this one's amazing," Amara said, holding up an essay. Maya smiled, looking at her daughter with pride. "Then let's give them the chance they deserve." Amara grinned, her mother's determination reflected in her young eyes. Together, they turned back to the work that never stopped, the work that changed lives. Because justice wasn't just an idea. It was a promise. And Maya had kept it.